what it means to be Canadian.
Fishing makes up 2% of the Canadian economy. There are 3 major classifications of fishing: commercial, sport, and First Nations. First Nations have little to no restrictions on the amount of fishing and keeping they are allowed to do, since they are doing it to feed themselves. Sport fishing is almost purely recreational and can be done in both fresh or salt water, no matter the time of year, where oceans and rivers don't freeze over and smaller lakes freeze to a point where ice fishing is very easy. Commercial fishing can also be done year-round, although in the winter, freshwater fishing becomes nearly impossible on a commercial level, so most of it is done in the warmer seasons.
Farming. There are 2 main types of farming in Canada: livestock, including poultry and eggs, and crop farming, which also includes fruits and vegetables. According to Statistics Canada, about 1.8% of the Canadian labor force works in the agriculture sector, about 330,000 Canadians. It is estimated that the Canadian agricultural industry comprises about 60 million hectares, and the number of farms in operation is approximately 230,000. The average household wage for a Canadian farming family is a little over $100,000 annually. Each year, Canada produces about 25 million metric tons of wheat, which is our #1 crop. But Canada is also the #1 producer of canola, with 14 million metric tons. It's also the 11th biggest producer of corn, at 10 million metric tons. It is estimated that there are approximately 12 million cattle and calves on approximately 82,000 farms and ranches, 41% of which are in Alberta. The hog industry in Canada is estimated to be about 13 million animals, and sheep are estimated to be just under 1 million. We are very lucky to live in a country that has both the agricultural space as well as the appropriate climate to produce so much food, both for our own consumption as well to export around the world.
Mining affects almost everything you do. Most things you've ever bought could never have been made without mining. How much mining is done in Canada, and how does it affect us? In 2015, the industry employed approximately 373,000 people. If all of those people were to lose their jobs, Canada's unemployment rate would take a staggering blow. Chances are, you know someone who works in the mining industry. Mining is also the largest employer of Aboriginal peoples in Canada. Mining is usually done in one of 3 ways: strip mining, open pit mining, or underground mining. Strip mining is where the overburn, which is the mining word for just about anything that gets in the way, is removed, then minerals near the surface are blasted out. Then a dragline picks up any loose material where it is shipped away. Open pit mining is usually used to mine ores relatively close to the surface, but may extend further down. Holes are dug 10 to 15 meters deep, then filled with explosives and blasted. From here, ore is taken to the surface in large trucks on winding roads and is taken to be processed. Finally, underground mining is used to extract minerals from deep underground. An elevator is built to take miners to the appropriate depth, where they will use large drills and/or explosives to chip away at the ore. They then build supports to prevent the mine from caving in. The ore is lifted up to the surface to be processed.
Forestry. In Canada, there are 347 million hectares of forest land. Coniferous makes up 68%, mixedwood makes up 16%, and broadleaf makes up 11%. Only 0.3% of Canada's forests are harvested each year. Annually, deforestation affects less than 0.02% of all Canada's forests. All harvested trees/forests on public land in Canada needs to be properly regenerated by replanting and replacing trees. The process of replanting trees is done to make sure we aren't cutting down trees faster than the new ones can grow to maturity. If we replant a new tree for each one we take down, we can maintain our forests at their present levels. This is called sustainability. There are 3 main methods of cutting down trees for resources: clear cutting, shelter wood methods, and selective cutting. Clear cutting is done by cutting down all or practically all trees in a specific area. Shelter wood is when older trees are cut while younger trees are left to grow. These trees can be left to be harvested in the future when needed. Lastly, there is selective cutting. Selective cutting is both useful and efficient, as only specific types of trees are cut down. The removal of dead or dying trees can be helpful in cases when older or dying trees prevent younger trees from getting their proper nutrients from the sun, either stunting their growth or even weakening them. Taking out older or dying trees gives us the wood we need while helping young trees grow healthily. There are 5 forest regions in Canada: West Coast, Montane, Taiga, boreal, and mixed forests.
Cities are a big part of Canadian culture. A whole third of Canadians live in only 3 cities: Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. But why do people live in these cities? One of the main reasons people live in cities is the culture. There's so much to do in Canadian cities than the Canadian countryside. A lot of this has to do with urbanization and how mechanization forced people to move to cities and start up their own businesses that make cities so exciting. Urbanization is the process of turning rural land into urban land, which then kicks a lot of people out of their farms and homes and are forced to live in cities. Other reasons so many people live in cities is that many cities are big transport hubs. A long time ago, people would move to large cities with rail networks and ports because that is where the jobs were. Now people tend to stick around in those same areas because those transport networks are still there. Depending on where you want to go, you can take transit, highways, roads, planes, boats, and in some places, even ski lifts.
Reasons for cold climate. Canada has quite the reputation of being freezing, which in many cases is quite realistic. But why exactly is Canada so cold? Well, one main reason Canada is so cold is its latitude. Since generally the further a place is from the equator, or 0 degrees latitude, the cooler that place is. And in most of Canada, or all of Canada, it's quite far from the equator. Cold air currents from the Arctic also keep most of Canada extremely cold, at least during certain parts of the year, especially winter. On the other hand, air currents from the Gulf of Mexico keep southern Canada warmer during the summer.
Geological history. The Earth is over 4 billion years old, so frankly, it must have gone through many changes. We can break up the Earth's geological changes into 4 geological eras: Precambrian, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic, in that order. The Precambrian era is when the first multicelled organisms came to be. It is also when the Canadian shield that covers most of our country was formed. The Paleozoic era is when life started to leave the oceans and above-ground plants started to appear. It's also when the Appalachian Mountains were formed. During this time, several parts of what is now North America was covered by shallow ocean. The Mesozoic era is when the first animals and birds evolved, as well as when dinosaurs ruled the world. It is also when most of the world's tallest mountain ranges were formed, such as Canada's Rocky and Inuitian Mountains. The shallow ocean from the last era comes and goes. The most recent and current era is the Cenozoic, where the world slowly turned into what it is now.
Immigrants. Canada is one of the most multicultural countries in the world, and the most multicultural of all the G8 countries. In Canada, 1 in 5 people were born in other countries. In terms of birthplace among immigrants, Canada is reported to have people from nearly 200 different countries. Roughly 56.9% come from Asia, including the Middle East, making Asia the biggest source of immigrants to Canada in the 2011 census. Between 2006 and 2011, over 1 million people have immigrated to Canada. The countries that make up the largest pools of immigrants to Canada are the Philippines at number 1 with 13%, followed by China with 10.5%, India with 10.4%, making up the rest of the top 10 in order are the US, Pakistan, the UK, Iran, South Korea, Colombia, and Mexico. The 4 provinces of Ontario, BC, Quebec, and Alberta make up the homes of over 85% of our immigrant population. Canada is now to be considered a world leader in immigration success. Many countries around the world are now studying Canadian models.
Canada is the country with the largest coastline, having coasts on 3 oceans: the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic. We have no shortage of salt water. Canada is also home to more lakes than any other country in the world, but it's the rivers that helped Canada form as a country. In the 1500s, when the French started to colonize Canada, they would divide up land in a way of giving every lot access to water, specifically the St. Lawrence River. This was known as the Long Lot System.
Access to water was vital at the time, for using the river was one of the only means of transportation. In the warm months, they would use boats to traverse the river, and in the cold, they would use the frozen river to their advantage. Compared to more modern ways of dividing land into lots, such as the concession or survey systems, the long lot system was designed without roads in mind on much more uneven ground, making it very unique.
First Nations people. Like most New World countries, Canada faces very specific challenges with respect to its past treatment of its Indigenous peoples, as well as their current quality of life as compared to the non-Indigenous population. First Nations people represent about 4% of the population of Canada, about 1.5 million people. In 2008, Canada's Prime Minister Stephen Harper stood up in the House of Commons to formally apologize to Canada's First Nations people for their treatment in the residential school system.
Today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
Despite this apology nearly a decade ago, Canada's First Nations people still continue to face very specific challenges. According to the most recent census information, 1 in 4 First Nations children grows up in poverty. Suicide rates among First Nations youth are 5 to 7 times higher than non-First Nations youth. Infant mortality among First Nations people is 1.5 times higher than the national average. As a wealthy first world country, Canada can and must address the plight of the First Nations people with more than just words. When people of other countries envision Canada, much of what they see comes from contributions of our First Nations people, their art, their distinctive dress, and their admirable respect for our vast environment.